Hello, everybody. Welcome to The Trouble Begins. I'm going to give this a couple seconds, a minute for everybody to get into the room. Welcome, welcome. All right, I see the attendees clicking up there, so great. All right, welcome everyone as you're joining. I'm just going to give it a minute for our attendee list number to get up to where I know it should be. Oh, it's still growing. All right. Welcome, everybody. All right, we're slowing down there a little bit on the numbers. So welcome everybody to the Mark Twain House Museum's Trouble Begins. As always, my name is Jody DeBrine. I'm the Director of Collections here at the Mark Twain House. We are so honored to have you all here tonight for this presentation. A little, housekeeping to do at the beginning. First, we want to thank our sponsors. The Center for Mark Twain Studies in Elmira, New York has been our sponsor for many years, as well as Webster Bank recently. If you'd like to support the series, I'm dropping a link into the chat where you can donate. I know if you have already donated when you purchased your ticket to here tonight or registered for tonight. Where I just placed that link is our chat box. Feel free to talk amongst yourselves during the event. Tell us where you're tuning in from. We have over 60 people and it keeps growing. 60 people in attendance already. We're expecting a whole lot more. So go ahead and say hello to us and to each other. If you have a question for Linda, however, down at the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A function. If you pop your question into that, I'll be sure to get to it at the end of our program. Now that that's all taken care of, our speaker tonight, Linda Morris. She's a professor of English at the University of California, Davis. She has received the Charlie Award for the American Humor Studies Association and the Olivia Langdon Clemens Award from the Mark Twain Circle of America. She has written extensively about 19th century and 20th century American women's humor, as well as Mark Twain, and along with a long list of articles. Her major work on Mark Twain is Gender Play in Mark Twain, Cross-Dressing and Transgression. Tonight, Linda is here to talk about Susy Clemens in her final years. I'm going to bring her back on screen, and as we're doing that, I will tell you, I saw Linda do a version of this talk at the conference over the summer, and it was wonderful. And so you guys are in for a real treat tonight. Trying to get Linda back onto video. There she is. Hello, Linda. Thank you so much for being here tonight.
Pleasure, a great pleasure.
All right. Well, I'm gonna turn it over to you. And when you're ready for that PowerPoint, let me know and I'll share the photos.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you, Jody, first of all, and the Mark Twain Hartford House Museum for inviting me to participate in this series. It's a real honor, and I'm delighted to be here. And I just wish I could see all of you because I love that interface, but I'll pretend I can, okay? So this, at the very end, I have a limited number of slides that I want to show you just for visual effect. But we're going to wait to the end for that. So I'll get going. And I want to talk to you about Susy Clemens and the final years. In this talk today, I'll look closely at the final 6 years in the life of Olivia Susan Clemens, known to her family as Susy, the eldest of 3 daughters of Livy and Sam Clemens, aka Mark Twain. This span of 6 years begins in 1890 as Susy prepared to enroll in Bryn Mawr College at the age of 18, and it ends with her unexpected and tragic death from spinal meningitis at the age of 24 in 1896. I will explore in this talk how she was developing a sense of herself in the passage from girlhood to early adulthood and what that journey was like for her. It was not a smooth passage, nor one that has been studied in much depth. In 1890, Susy began to prepare for Bryn Mawr's challenging entrance exams in 6 different subjects, comparable in rigor to the exams required for admission to Harvard. Susy was tutored in part by Harriet Foote, sister of Lily Foote, who had been a governess in the Clemens household in the early 1880s. More about Lily Foote later in the talk. She took exams in 6 subjects: arithmetic, algebra, English, physical geography, German grammar and translation, and Latin grammar and composition and Virgil. To me, that says 7, but everyone else says it's 6, so be it. She passed the exams and was admitted to Bryn Mawr. Even so, she still had to pass exams in French grammar and translation and plane geometry in the fall of 1890. Immediately upon entering Bryn Mawr, she began to call herself Olivia with her new friends and classmates. Her separation from her family was not easy for any of them, and there are a number of references to her initially being homesick. But she made her way at Bryn Mawr, and because of her singing ability, was chosen to play a lead role as Phyllis in a production of Gilbert and Sullivan's comic opera, Idealized. Susy became part of a small group of friends, and most significantly, she fell in love with a more senior student and student leader, Louis Brownell. Theirs was a passionate and mutual relationship, and Louise invited Susy to room with her in the following year. But that never happened. Instead, Susy was called home to Hartford in April of that first year, and on June 5, left with her family for an extended stay in Europe. Biographers have debated why precisely Susy left Bryn Mawr in April, but this much we know for certain. As early as the fall of 1890, Sam and Livy, as I will call her parents, had been anticipating closing down the Hartford house and moving to Europe to reduce their living expenses, a move made necessary by their ever-growing debt and Sam Clemens' bad investments. Their actual leaving was by no means spontaneous. It took considerable planning to close down the Hartford house, to assist long-term faithful employees in finding new positions, and to make future plans. There was no way they were going to leave Susy behind, nor any way she would have wanted to have been separated in this way from her family for what was the foreseeable future. This does not explain why she withdrew from Bryn Mawr in April, and we will likely never know the full details. But once the decision to leave the country was made, Susy chose not to return to Bryn Mawr to finish out the year. In June of 1891, she sailed with her family to Europe, where they would remain for the next 4 years. We owe much of our knowledge about the relationship between Susy and Louise Brownell to the fact that they lived an ocean apart, which meant that over time, Susy wrote more than 38 intimate and personally revealing letters to Louise, all of which Louise saved and which are now in the archives at Hamilton College. Susy's letters make it clear that Louise wrote an almost equal number to her, but not one of them remains. Were they lost in travel? Did the family destroy them after her death? We simply do not know. Let me describe briefly the intimacy revealed in Susy's letters to Louise, beginning with the salutations, which are especially touching and loving. For instance, many letters are addressed to my dearest, my beloved Louise, dearly beloved, or dearest love. The ends of her letters are often even more affectionate. From the first letter, which ends with "My own sweetest and best, I love you forever," and they continued in the same vein, even 2 years later, when she wrote, "Good night, my dearly beloved, and I love you with my whole heart. There is no one lovelier than you. You must love me, please, no matter what I do or say or am. Will you? Your own, your very own." There are also references to physical intimacy in the letters. For example, when Bryn Mawr began in the fall of 1891, absent Susy, she wrote, "I think of you these days, the first of college. If I could only look in on you, we would sleep together tonight, and I would allow you opportunities for those refreshing little naps you always indulged in when we passed a night together." A few days later, she wrote, "My darling, I do love you so, and I feel so separated from you. If you were here, I would kiss you hard on that little place that tastes so good, just on the right side of your nose. Goodbye. I give myself to you over and over again to make sure there is no mistake. We belong to each other. You are my own dear, dear darling." Susy's letters to Louise trace the Clemens family restless travels across Europe for the first year and a half before they settled down for a 9-month stay at Villa Viviani outside Florence, beginning in October of 1892. Her letters are postmarked from Switzerland, Berlin, Trient, Rome, Venice, Nauheim, Frankfurt, Cassino, Bad Nauheim, Florence, and Paris. One of the key themes that arises in these letters, besides her concentration on her relationship with Louise, is her loneliness and frequent boredom, seemingly with little else going on in her daily life other than sewing and reading. Her sister Clara was off studying in Berlin. Sister Jean was too young to be much of a companion for Susy, and she had few acquaintances. One of the more intriguing letters is one in which Susy tells Louise that Livy's sister, Susan Crane, Aunt Sue, as she was called, who had been visiting, had gone back home without getting Susy's blood to rise in a revolt against you, Louise. We do not know what the circumstances involved were, but it suggests to me that Aunt Sue might have understood the relationship between Susy and Louise more fully than Livy appears to have done. Among the most interesting and detailed letters tells Louise of the first time Susy met the British writer Vernon Lee, a strong feminist, a cross-dresser, and a lesbian. As Susy's letter makes clear, Louise would have known who Vernon Lee was, would have known her writing, and would have shared Susy's interest in how Vernon Lee presented herself. And I quote, "The only event of the week has been the meeting of Vernon Lee. A most attractive Russian lady invited us to a small tea where she was to present. Well, she was not as I had pictured her, gauche, homely, atrociously dressed. She seemed entirely ill at ease and out of her element. She was in every particular decidedly unattractive, almost repulsive, and yet, although she disappointed everyone in the room and was neglected and ignored and seemed to have no magnetism, no presence at all, still, after all, there was a pathetic, approachable quality about her personality, a humanness, a kind of half-deprecatory appeal for sympathy, and I did want to get acquainted with her. She only spoke one word to us on introduction and another when she went out, so I only watched from across the room. Of course, she's a brilliant woman. She carried that about with her somewhere in some subtle way." Susy goes on to ask Louise to send her Vernon Lee's book, Miss Brown, which Louise had previously offered to send, and evidently she did then, for later Susy tells Louise in some detail why she thought the book was disappointing. Susy longed for more emotional intimacy with Louise, but at the same time revealed deep insecurities about herself, a theme that runs throughout the letters, but is made explicit after 3 years' separation from Louise. But the truth is that what I would tell you of myself will not go on paper. It is quite out of the question, but it will keep. But in general, since you want to know, I'm rather discontented and unhappy for various reasons, and I don't seem to have enough raison d'etre. I would rather you know my sins, all of them, and trials too, but since they're both rather strange and vulgar, I'm not sure you wouldn't be shocked by them. Overall, the sense of Susy that comes through in her letters to Louise is a young woman with many self-doubts and insecurities, but a person fully committed to a relationship with Louise. And we do know that in 1894, Susy was allowed to travel to London to meet up with Louise, who was studying there on a postgraduate fellowship from Bryn Mawr. But we know little of the nature of that reunion, except what she reveals in one final letter to Louise. Here, she absolutely panics at the thought that they might not meet up in Paris as she had hoped. This letter, which is almost painful to read because of how Susy begs Louise to let her see her one more time, nevertheless ends on this note. Good night, darling, darling, my beloved. I take you in my arms and see you clearly as you were in London. What a fated friendship ours is. Oh, I long for you so. The loneliness of life is the hardest. It would, in fact, be 1896 before they were united again, this time at Quarry Farm in Elmira, New York, under Aunt Sue's watchful eye. We also learn much about Susy's life abroad during this period through a series of letters she wrote to her sister Clara, who spent much of her time studying music in Berlin and therefore away from the family. Not surprising, these letters are even more personally revealing than her letters to Louise. Among the other things she writes about, though does not explain, is a growing tension between herself and her father. Most pointedly, she complains to Clara that she doesn't want to, quote, go down to breakfast because her father, quote, pierces me through with his eyes as if he were determined to see whether I am embarrassed or not. Oh, well, she adds, I will keep sewing and reading and trying to make the best of everything, but I must say it's a good deal of an effort. A month later, she reported to Clara that she indeed no longer did go downstairs to breakfast, and things go on very peacefully. Elsewhere, she advises Clara in the most emphatic terms not to even think about leaving Berlin and returning to the family in Italy. I really cannot bear to have you make the experiment, for I feel sure you would be so unhappy. Of course, I can only judge from my experience. I'm contented here much of the time and satisfied, but with me it is different, for entre nous, I have rather given up expecting much real happiness, constructed as I am and all. But you have your music, your work, your talent, your natural good luck, so why should you come here when you might as well stay in a gayer, freer place? Clara, my dear Clara, be careful what you do. You know how you will be fretted here by the family discipline after the freedom of the Willard School. You seem to forget the life of the Villa Viviani. What are you thinking? Two things strike me as especially revealing in this letter to Clara. The first and most important is Susy's sense of how restricting life is at Villa Viviani and how that would grate on Clara. While she does not say exactly how Clara would be fretted by the family, I believe the implication is that it would be by their father, who was elsewhere described as moody and stern. Further, there's no indication that Livy in any way emotionally constrained her daughters. The second point is Susy's own characterization of herself in contrast with Clara, whom she perceives as enjoying a much fuller, more meaningful life, in contrast with herself, who has given up, quote, expecting much real happiness, constructed as I am, and all. For me, the overall sense of Susy that emerges in this period as reflected in her letters is a relatively unhappy and insecure person who, although bright and articulate, is full of self-doubt. She was understandingly bored by her very limited social life and isolation. Read so. She increasingly expressed having low expectations for herself, a growing sense of disappointment, and a growing concern that if Louise truly knew her, she too would be disappointed. Meanwhile, there were growing indications that Susy's health was declining. In 1893, she was taking singing lessons, but became short of breath while singing. She was also not sleeping well. Livy, reported to Sam, who was in New York, that she had just taken Susy to visit a new doctor in Paris. And here's Livy's statement. He says there's some extension of the cells of the lungs. He thinks it comes from anemia and will not long resist treatment. I like him exceedingly. He says that one great trouble with her is that she is not sufficiently developed, particularly her chest. He's going to have her take gymnastics for developing that, and also massage. I hope now she will soon be on the road to health. It has been very pitiful to see her look so miserable, and sometimes it has been hard to keep cheerful with her so downhearted. As the family's financial situation declined even further, Sam began to contemplate undergoing an extended speaking tour to Australia, India, and South Africa. He apparently first contemplated such a tour in the fall of 1893. A year later, in 1894, he contacted his U.S. agent, James Pond, about such a trip, who in turn connected him to Robert Sparrow Smythe, who had managed Henry Stanley's Australia engagements 4 years earlier. Smythe was interested in arranging such a tour, which promised to raise a significant amount of money, and the overall plans were laid. So to prepare for this tour, in May of 1895, the Clemens family came home from Europe after a 4-year absence and went to Quarry Farm in Elmira to stay there as they had for so many summers with Livy's sister, Susan Crane. Their house in Hartford was rented out and therefore not available to them. In Elmira, they made the final arrangement for their tour of Australia and beyond, and it was there that the family made the surprising decision to allow Susy to remain behind with Aunt Sue in Elmira, while Clara accompanied her mother and father on their extended trip. If Susy was to stay at Quarry Farm, then Jean would as well, where she could continue her schooling. Katie Leary, who worked for the Clemens family for many years and was a trusted friend, confirmed that it was Susy herself who made the decision not to accompany her parents on that trip, a decision she at times later regretted. In Katie's telling of the story, that decision was so Susy could stay home and get stronger and therefore be able to sing better. Sam said she stayed home because she hates the sea, while Clara later stated that, quote, she preferred the comforts of home to uncertain joys in India and Africa. On June 14, 1895, Sam, Livy, and Clara left for their tour, planning for all to be reunited in a year's time in Europe. Tragically, this reunion was never to take place. Again, much of what we know for certain about Susy's activities and feelings during what turned out to be her final year are based on her letters to Clara, but also from Livy's letters, from the writings of Katie Leary, and from bits and pieces of many biographies. One of the themes that runs through Susy's letters to Clara is once again being bored, or as she wrote at one point, things go on here just as they did, pleasantly, evenly, and absolutely uneventfully. Apparently, however, it was not always uneventful. One of the most disturbing and disturbed letters Susy wrote to Clara reveals her rather extreme frustration and an avowed dislike of Aunt Sue. I do not really love anybody but you, dear three, and of course, nobody else loves me. I get on perfectly with Aunt Sue, never a hitch or a jar between us, but this is because I never think of doing anything but singing her praises from morning till night. Even Jean said, you're never rude or disagreeable to Aunt Sue, which is because I always play a part with her. I cannot respect her or love her. Her behavior towards Ernest disgusts me. More on Ernest in a minute. Again, back to Susy. I cannot respect her or love her. In anyone else, her behavior would create gossip. He spends the evenings with her in her bedroom and talks with her long talks on the front porch. She smiles and smirks at him as if he were her lover, and she interrupts me no matter what I am saying in order to speak with him when he comes in from the pantry with bread and butter. I never have a visit with Aunt Sue because I will not sit near him. So he takes on her evenings and I flee to my own room. Yet, I want you to understand, I get on perfectly, and there is no discord between Aunt Sue and me, although she really insults me at the table by ignoring me and talking almost exclusively to him. My opinion of Aunt Sue remains what it was in Europe. I don't suppose I ought to write this, and don't show it to Mama if it will offend her, and on no account to Papa. Mama is a great woman, and Aunt Sue is infinitely little. But excuse me. Sticky paper. Sorry. There really is a page here. It seems that Ernest, who was Ernest Kopp, became the trusted gardener and caretaker of Quarry Farm. He was invited by Clara to come from Germany to the United States and work for Sue. I'm sorry, he was invited by Sue to come from Germany to the US and work for her at Quarry Farm. Ernest was, in fact, only 3 years older than Susy, and even more to the point, 33 years younger than Aunt Sue. So the representation of their relationship as a serious flirtation seems suspect. And what does the letter say about Susy herself? Elsewhere, Susy writes explicitly of being disappointed in herself. I am often deeply cast down with the thought of how I failed to be what I should have been to you all. This realization takes possession of me and horrifies me often in the middle of the night. What I find different about Susy's self-doubt and self-dissatisfaction now, compared to her time in Florence and her jealousy of Ernest aside, is that she begins actively to seek change herself. The terms in which she expresses this determination, while disconcerting to read and hear, nonetheless shows a genuine desire to change. I have become determined to get hold of a philosophy that will, if possible, straighten me out morally, mentally, and physically, and make me less of a burden to myself and others. I am tired of all my sins and all myself. This hitch, this discord, this restlessness, making every undertaking impossible and spoiling and frittering away my life. Why should it not be trampled underfoot and annihilated? I have written Miss Foote a questioning letter about mind cure and hope that she is going to help me live anew. The practice of mental science or mind cure emerged as early as the 1840s through the teaching of Phineas B. Quimby and spread quickly and widely through the efforts of four of his early patients turned teachers: Warren Evans, Julius and Annette Dresser, and Mary Baker Eddy. The clearest description of mind cure per se that I have been able to find was offered by David T. Schmidt, who wrote an extensive history of the work of the aforementioned Warren Evans. He writes, mind cure eludes easy description or appraisal. Adding to its elusiveness were the several names it was known by: mental healing, metaphysical healing, Christian science, mental science, psychological medicine, psychotherapy, new thought, and occasionally faith healing. Although mind curists differed amongst themselves about the particulars, they shared an idea common to metaphysical idealism, that humans possess the mental power to alter the material world by way of metaphysical or spiritual properties in the soul. End quote. In its heyday, the movement was centered in Boston, but it soon spread widely. In the 1890s, mind cure was popular in Hartford, where hundreds of people were reported to having been treated by mind healing sciences, and many women especially were said to have been cured by the practice. Initially, both Susy's parents encouraged her to engage with mental science, to seek help with her physical and emotional problems. In particular, Sam urged her to seek out help from Lily Foote, their former governess and grandniece of Harriet Beecher Stowe, and Susy did just that. In response to a letter from Alice Day, Livy wrote that even she would be willing to get Christian Science treatments for herself and Susy, quote, in spite of her fear of charlatanism in this as in other things. In December 1895, in a long letter from Livy to Susy, she wrote, "I am most truly thankful that you are getting interested in mental science. I hope it will do you endless good. Please give my love to Miss Foote and give her my most deep thanks." In the end, however, Sam, Livy, and Clara all blamed mental science for Susy's death. No one said so more forcefully than Clara in a letter to long-term friend Alice Hooker Day. And I quote, "Susy, you know, was simply killed by mental science and spiritualism. Without the least exaggeration, a murder it was, a demented, cold-blooded, unforgivable murder." Even knowing how the family came to try to understand Susy's death, I have come to believe that Susy's involvement with mental science or mind cure did have a positive effect on her in her final year of life. Certainly, she believes so. She seemed to have become more self-assured, and the difference in the tone of her letters to Clara between September 1895 and December of that year is striking. For instance, she reported that, quote, "Thanks to mental science, she got on finely at a Christmas ball." And she reported to Clara that she herself was offering mental science treatments to others and effecting cures. More explicitly, that month, she reported to Clara, "I have learned to meet people with ease and comfort through the help of mental science." She then goes on to attempt to explain to Clara how mental science works. I quote in part her explanation here, but make no attempt to interpret her words. And I do quote, "The mental sciences say for convenience that we have a staff of being, existence, with a positive and negative end. The negative end, which is the end swayed and moved and affected, a soul affected, in other words, we are to extend toward God and eternal truths. And the positive end, which is the firm, strong, immovable end, in other words, the soul effecting, we must turn toward people and the world. If this balance is kept, we are not swayed and moved and disturbed by people. One doesn't have to control one's external manner. It may be quiet or talkative, but the inner attitude must be right, and then the real poise is felt." In this same letter, Susy reported to Clara in some detail that she had an especially positive experience while visiting Clara's friend Lily Burbank in Orange, New Jersey. She was accompanied to Orange from Elmira by Louis Brownell, and she stayed in a household she described as full of histrionic characters. In fact, Susy was involved in an unnamed dramatic presentation to an enthusiastic audience specifically assembled to impress Louise, which apparently succeeded. This included Susy doing an impersonation of the dramatic actress Sarah Bernhardt. She also visited with Louise in New York, where Susy stayed for 3 weeks with the William Dean Howells family. Quote, "The truth is, I have had a succès fou, or a great success in New York, thanks to mental science, and without the help or presence of that mighty power, the Grey Grand Oui, the Grey Frog, that is to say, her father." This is a curious reference indeed, indicating, I believe, the way in which her father's influence, power haunted her, but suggesting too that she was beginning to feel that she was coming into her own. I have to believe too that renewed in-person contact with Louise had a positive effect on her sense of self. There's indication too that her singing ability and strength were progressing, as witnessed by some who knew her well during her final days in Hartford. For example, here was Katie Leary's report. "I took a little apartment on Spring Street. I lived in it, and Susy would come over every day to do her practicing. People used to listen to her from the street, and I remember one boy that used to come every day to listen. Well, there was always a crowd outside in the street listening to Susy sing, for she had a wonderful voice, and really, we had a concert every afternoon." Not everyone in Hartford was so impressed by Susy, however, and one troublesome posthumous note from an acquaintance of Grace King indicated that King's sister, quote, "was relieved to see that the poor girl did not commit suicide. She was so morbid and distressed, poor thing. No doubt excitement brought on meningitis." It is difficult to know how much weight to give to such an observation, but it certainly suggests that people outside the family and immediate friends saw Susy in a more critical light. In the days leading up to her death, Susy was in fact spending some of her daytimes in the family house in Hartford, where friends had been living. Along with her sister Jean and Katie Leary, she was awaiting word from her parents that it was time to go down to New York City, and from there to sail to England to rejoin her sister and parents after more than a year's absence. That word, in fact, did come, but Susy was feeling ill, and Katie wired Sam and Livy that they needed to wait a few days before they could set out for New York. Let me briefly lay out for you what we know about the final days of Susy's life. Although clearly ill, Susy did not want a doctor called in, but Katie Leary insisted and called upon a Dr. Porter, reportedly the best doctor in Hartford. She and Susy now stayed full-time at the family Hartford house. Aunt Susan Crane came over from Elmira, as did Livy's brother Charlie, and they were also joined by longtime friend Joe Twitchell, who came down from the Adirondacks. On August 14, Susy was diagnosed with spinal meningitis, and there was nothing medical science could do in that time to stop the course of meningitis, be it viral or bacterial in origin. There were as yet no antibiotics to treat the bacterial form, and even now there's no fully reliable treatment for viral meningitis. The disease developed rapidly in Susan, and as it did, she became increasingly delirious. Her delirium was in part expressed through incoherent writing that she scribbled on lined pieces of paper, writing against the lines. She fancied that she had as her companion Madame Milbran, a famous Parisian mezzo-soprano who had died 60 years before. It is impossible to make sense of this writing, except to see in it a kind of urgency, but it is truly delirious. Within only a few days, Susy was too weak to get out of bed and she became blind. At noon on the 18th of August, 1896, she fell into a coma and she died that evening. Having been informed that Susy was ill and could not sail as planned, Livy and Clara immediately sailed from England to join her in Hartford. But she died while they were at sea. Her father's report of receiving word of her death still stands out for me as one of the most moving passages he wrote. When my wife and Clara were about halfway across the ocean, I was standing in our dining room, thinking of nothing in particular, when a cablegram was put into my hand. It said, "Susy was peacefully released today." It is one of the mysteries of our nature that a man all unprepared can receive a thunder stroke like that and live. Later, Sam Clemens, Mark Twain wrote eloquently and at length about Susy and about the effect of her death upon him and upon his family. She was, he said, their prodigy. Less well-known are Livy's words of profound loss as expressed in letters to intimate friends, and I end with these two eloquent examples of her grief. To her dear long-term friend Alice Hooker-Day, she wrote, "I had looked forward with so much pleasure to our all being together again here at this time, your girls and our girls, and now my world is dark. I cannot find Susy, and I cannot find the light. No one knows, and only Mr. Clemens and Clara can suspect what Susy was to me." And finally, fully a year and a half after Susy's death, she wrote to her friend Grace King these words, "Of course, I cannot at all reconcile myself to going on in this world with Susy gone out of it. She was my great pride and joy always. Now I cannot make anything seem worthwhile, yet I try to go on as if it were. Oh, Grace, you cannot conceive what it is to have such a child taken from you. I cannot yet believe it can be true. I loved that child peculiarly because she needed me peculiarly. Then I went and left her." Thank you for your attention. Shall we go to the PowerPoint? Okay. And
Yes, I am sharing it now.
There we go. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, so this is a photo of Susy at Bryn Mawr, and obviously in her cap and gown. Okay, next. This is a photo taken of her in Italy, in Florence, and there's a reference in a letter to Louise that, in fact, Susy was going to get her photo taken because Louise requested it, and I imagine that's exactly what this is. I think it's quite stunning, frankly.
It is. We have it up in our offices.
You do? Great.
Yeah.
Okay, next. This is Villa Viviani in today's world, and the photo, thank you, Larry Howe. It's still an imposing place, and it's I guess it's an inn and a restaurant now, but it's sat up on the hill overlooking Florence, and this is where they stayed for 9 some months. Next. Vernon Lee. 2 different photos of her. I like both of them, frankly, but I think the one on what is my right, I hope it's your right too, with she's not she's not cross-dressed there, but she's, there's an attitude there, and it shows. Okay. Don't try to read all of this. I put this up because this is the final letter that we have that she wrote to Susy, and it's not obviously her script. It's been transcribed, but what they had to do to try to capture the near hysteria of what she was writing. I could not dream this might have happened, that I might lose you now at the moment of having you again after all these years of waiting. It is impossible. I cannot believe it. I cannot be true. Oh no, dear Louise, my darling, it is dreadful. I cannot hear it. And on she goes for a good while at this rate. She really was devastated at the thought she would not see Louise again in Europe. And indeed, she did not. Okay. This is Quarry Farm then. It's been, this is the house that Susan Crane, Aunt Susie, lived in and welcomed the Clemens family to every winter, summer after summer after summer, and made them welcome. And so much of Sam's writing was done here. And it was really a remarkable place. And for those of us who are Mark Twain scholars and have been fortunate to be able to stay there and do our work, because it is still open to scholars. It's just a marvelous place, was then and still is. Okay. A photo of Aunt Sue. I don't know when it was taken. I think it's probably later than the time that Susy was staying with her, and Aunt Sue lived a good long while, but I don't know, there's something very appealing about her there, and I think it's probably appropriate. Okay, 1 more or 2 more. Thank you. The Hartford house, the brilliant, beautiful Hartford house. I have to confess, I took this photo off the front of Steve Courtney's fabulous book about the Hartford house. And if you don't know it, you should. And it's really a joy to read it. And if you haven't been there in person, which in the olden days, we would assume you were, because this is sponsored by this museum. But now we are scattered all over the place. If you get a chance, by all means, go to the Hartford house. Okay. This is the beginning of Susy's delirium notes. They go on page after page after page, unconnected, interchangeable, but this is the beginning. You, we're not quite sure, will be held by and obey me in order that you can hold and command the world. Say, I will try not to doubt, and I will obey my benefactress, Madame Malibran. Now I can better hold you. You must not deliberately question me and my wisdom while I am only making the destiny which you feel in your heart possible. I do not allow such treatment. Say, I will obey, Madame Millibrand. I freely decide to obey, or now go and hold this song. Nothing but indecision. And it does go on, sadly, like that. And is there one more? Yes. Oh, this is sent down to me from the Mark Twain papers by Ben Griffin. Actual photos of the actual pages that she wrote on. It's very faint, but if you look very closely, you can see that the lines are on the paper are going up and down, and her writing is going cross, and it's just getting bigger and bigger and more out of control. All right, one more. No, two more, sorry. Too small to read. This was a letter that Livy wrote to Grace King, in which she laments the loss. And so let's move on then to the final one, which is Susy's tombstone in the family plot in Elmira. And the poem on here was chosen by her father. Warm summer sun, shine kindly here. Warm southern wind, blow softly here. Green sod above, lie light, lie light. Good night, dear heart. Good night, good night. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Linda. That was such a good presentation. You definitely do not disappoint at all. Just as good as I remembered it from Elmira. So thank you so much. I do want to say that we have over 100 people here tonight, and that is such a good crowd for us. And we so appreciate everybody being here. And we do have many questions from the audience. So are you ready for them?
You tell me.
I think you are. All right. So to start, Kevin McDonald, who we're all familiar with, asks, is there any evidence of perfectionism or eating disorders in Susy's behavior? I ask because this was common among young women from wealthy or socially prominent families in the late 19th century who felt pressure to live up to parental or societal expectations.
So was there pressure to live up to expectations? You bet there was. But in particular, there was evidence of eating disorder.
Okay.
So yeah, thanks, Kevin, for the question. Yes, is the answer.
Great. Jonathan asks, did her father ever come to accept her as an adult?
He really, I don't think so. I think he dwelled on her as a child. And I mean, he had great hopes for her as a writer, apparently, but I don't think he ever really knew her as an adult. And she didn't have that long a time as an adult is also part of the issue, of course. And he certainly came to accept Clara as an adult. So for what that's worth. Yeah.
So similarly in that vein, Sarah asks, what does your research suggest about Samuel Clemens' awareness of his daughter's growing animosity? Was he oblivious or dismissive of their relationship or souring relationship?
I don't have any evidence of his awareness. That doesn't mean it wasn't there, but I haven't read it. And again, because he wrote so prolifically about her at the time of her death and after, and frequently after, he does not address, as far as I know, others may know much better about this than I do. He does not particularly address those issues. I mean, he idolizes her. I mean, that's to me, that's the right word. He completely idolizes her. And even when she, she wrote this thing called Papa, which was when she was 12 or 13 years old, a biography of her father. And he loved it. He absolutely loved it. And when he interjected himself in it, when it never, as far as I know, was ever published without his interjections. So there's a way in which he couldn't let her just speak what she wanted to speak. He had to jump in and kind of overpower it, and from my perspective. But
Yeah.
I was also trying very hard, and it's hard to do, to not let him overpower this discussion or my writing about Susy, because of course we're interested in her because of who she was.
Mhm.
At the same time, you start looking and Sam comes in, and he's there. So I tried in this one, I don't know how long I'll ever be able to keep this up, of just keeping that focus on her. So
Oh, it's wonderful. Yeah, but he's a commanding force, definitely.
he is.
So let me see. So we have a couple questions about Louise. So the first one is, do you know what happened to her?
Yes, indeed, I do. First of all, she was apparently a brilliant student. She went on to get a PhD from Bryn Mawr. I didn't know that was possible in those days. She taught at Cornell.
Wow.
And there she met the man who was to be her husband. And they went from there to over to to the next school over. Sorry. And they had Hamilton. Oh, sorry, Hamilton. I've just been. You got to have somebody who'll keep you on track. The Hamilton College, and they lived out their lives there. She had several children, including one daughter, whom she named after Susy, but
Oh, wow.
she named her Olivia because that's all she knew her by. Never called her. She named her Olivia Clemens Saunders, which was the last name.
Oh, wow. That's a really touching tribute.
It is, and she wrote to Clemens to tell him this. By this time, not only was Susy long gone, but so was Livy, and he did respond. A little terse for my point of view, but he did respond. So.
Oh, that's wonderful. So the other question on, oh, you guys keep adding more, so I keep losing them. It says, would you comment further on the impediments to Susy and Louise's living together in a Boston marriage?
Well, I won't call it that.
Okay.
Because they didn't.
Right.
I'm fully aware of the term, and I don't refute it at all, but it's not what happened. They did not. And what would the impediments have been? That's a whole other story. You can imagine.
Yes. All right.
If I'm understanding the question correctly.
Yes, you are. Yes. Okay. All right. Let's see what else is here. There's lots of them. So Stephanie asks, what was mental science also called Christian Science, and did they at the time say that you could not? Hold on. And did they at the time say that you could not use any medicine for illness?
Okay.
So, yeah.
Okay. There's a multiple answer to that question.
Okay.
Christian Science was one of the branches that came from this, but is not the same as some of the other variations that grew out of the original things. So, and it's the only one that became, quote, a religion. And is, as we know, is still extant. And so Susy did not want medicine. She did not want it brought in, but and she, of course, did have any idea how ill she was. But the whole idea was that there was almost nothing medicine was doing at that time. I mean, without antibiotics, you may as well not worry about it. And
yeah, so
I mean, I think the idea was that just, first of all, there are two, this is what happens, you start branching out. Susy was into it insofar as she was about her mental health and about her attitude towards life. But mental science, Christian Science, whatever, also concerns itself very much with physical health. And that's not the direction from which Susy came. So there's a very strong sense that you can control your life and how you behave and how people respond to you, and you can learn to do that. And that's what I think she was learning or trying to learn.
Okay, that's a good answer. Along that same thread, though, Beth asks, why did the family blame Mind Cure for her death?
Wonderful question. I don't know. I can't answer it. But here's what I think. I think, first of all, they were so astonished and horrified at her death that, like any of us, you try to find a reason. You know, how did this happen? How can we explain this to ourselves? And I believe that their sense was that they did not call a doctor in soon enough.
Mm-hmm.
There was all of this excitement around mental health going on, and that somehow, some of the ways that they talk about it is that the excitement affected her and made her ill, is one of those statements I read suggested. But I also think there was just that feeling that there has to be a reason. There has to be a reason why this happened. And because she did not immediately get doctors' attention. I mean, you have to think about all of the ways that Sam and Livy over the years, you know, went to spas and to health places. I mean, they were not opposed to trying to find ways to cure rheumatism and arthritis and carbuncles and, you know, all of the things that came along. So they did everything they could, and they just felt, and Clara, of course, was so outspoken about it that that there had to have been a reason, and that this was the reason, and it was unnecessary. She didn't have to die.
Right. Right. But as you say, without modern medicine, maybe, you know, maybe even if they would have called a doctor, maybe that the outcome would have been the same. We just don't know. So.
Well, and they did finally call one in, and he
right.
diagnosed it and basically said, there's nothing we can do, you know?
Yeah.
And any physician I've talked to about this, contemporary physician, will say, oh, there's not a lot we can do now, you know?
Right.
This is, yeah, so.
Yeah, but grief does lots of things. So I know we're getting close to time, but we do have a couple more. Allison asks, given your research, what role do you believe Susy's internalized homophobia played in her emotional health? What drew you to this research?
Well, I haven't seen evidence of the phobia unless you talk about her response to Vernon Lee. And because I certainly don't see evidence that, you know, oh, Louise, I should never love you this way.
Right.
Quite the contrary. But if what you read into her response to Vernon Lee is a repulsion of her way of being, she keeps talking about how she was drawn to her, and what, you know, that there was this kind of, not a magnetism about her. So even in that, even as she describes her about how atrocious she was and all, there's a sense of, you know, push-pull. So
yeah. Going off of that a little bit, do you think that her attempt into the mind cure and things like that was in some ways trying to change herself so that she would stop being so in love with Louise or anything like that? Or is it, what, you know, is that part of it?
It's impossible to know because they were actually together. We don't have the letters. I mean, it's so much of what we know, literally know, not just conjecture, about the Clemens life has to do with how far they were away from other people and all of the letters and things that passed between them. So once she gets back to the United States and sees Louise again, we have no record except for the times that they actually did get together, but we don't know. And you know, yeah, I can speculate, but I'm sure that there was some distancing, but was probably on both parts, you know. But
yeah,
we really don't know. So,
Society aside, do you think Susy has lifelong issues with living up to being Mark Twain's daughter?
Yes. Yes.
I think they all do.
I really do. And I didn't have the exact quote of in her delirium in the last few days of her life, when she could still get up and walk around. I mean, that she said, that the trolleys, you probably have the quote, the trolleys go up and down the road for Mark Twain's daughter. And she couldn't ever get away, really, from that. And she didn't always try either. So
Right. Did their grief and blame of mental science sever their relationship with Lily Foote?
Oh, I've tried to find out more about that, but I'll bet it did. I think there's no question that if she was still, first of all, they were never back in Hartford.
Right.
So they wouldn't have had a close relationship in any event, but I am sure it would have made things very different and very distant.
Yeah, at least suffered, yes.
Yeah.
All right, the last question as of now, so the last question for the night, maybe because Livy was sickly, I get the impression she might have been needy as well. Would Susy leaving college early perhaps be due to the neediness of her mother?
We don't know. I wish we did. I wish we knew why. Some people write about it and say Livy called her home. I don't use that language, but maybe I should. We don't know, but they were certainly bonded. They were very, very bonded, and nothing that I've ever seen suggests a change in that. It was a very, very powerful mother-daughter bond. So.
Well, thank you so much, Linda. I so appreciate you spending a little bit over an hour with us this evening talking about Susy, and mostly just Susy, not just Sam Clemens and Mark Twain, who we love. But I cannot thank you enough for agreeing to do this for the Mark Twain House as Trouble Begins. It's such a pleasure.
No, it's a mutual pleasure then. I love doing it. Thank you.
Good. And I hope to see you in person at the Mark Twain House soon. I hope to see everybody in the audience at the Mark Twain House soon in person or at one of our other virtual events. We have a lot of literary programs happening. We have some Christmas themed programs happening this weekend and next week, both virtual and in person. So check out our calendar events. I just dropped the link into the chat for everybody. And if you want to relive Linda's talk or any of the other recorded Trouble Begins that we have, you can always go to our website. There's a Trouble Begins page on there with links to all of the talks. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, and good night.
Good night. Thanks so much.